In the entire world of weed, the single most hyped title out there has always been the crown for the strongest strain on the whole planet. And these days, that particular crown honestly gets passed around constantly, going to whatever brand new strain just so happens to test the highest that year. But if you rewind all the way back to the late 1990s, one single legendary strain wore that exact crown like no other. Because at a certain time in history, it was considered to be the single strongest weed in the entire world. This is the story of White Russian. So let's start with what White Russian actually is. It's a classic indica-leaning hybrid strain, and it comes from the respected Amsterdam seed company Serious Seeds. It was first born all the way back in 1996, and back in its heyday, it was honestly one of the single most legendary and potent strains of its entire era. It was a big deal, and the very first thing everyone notices about it is just how incredibly frosty it is. The buds are caked in a thick layer of glittering white crystals, so heavy that they honestly look like they've been completely rolled around in sugar. And that beautiful frosty white coat is exactly where the word white in its name comes from. It's a gorgeous, classic-looking kind of plant. And it honestly tastes just about as rich as it actually looks. It's got this nice sweet and fruity flavor to it, with a distinct citrusy, almost orange kind of note, all backed up by these deeper, earthy, spicy, piney, and skunky undertones. It all comes together into a smooth, rich, and sometimes almost creamy kind of smoke that people really love. But the high is really where this strain first earned its whole fearsome reputation. Because it tends to hit you pretty fast, with a strong, soaring, and euphoric head high that makes you feel really social and talkative, all backed up by a nice relaxing buzz throughout the body. It actually leans a bit more heady and cerebral than it does sleepy. But if you push it a little too far, it will plant you into the couch. And fair warning here, this is a truly powerful one, and it can easily be a bit too much for a total beginner. Now, there's a really common misconception about where this strain's name actually comes from. A whole lot of people just naturally assume that the name comes from the famous cocktail of the same name, or maybe even the classic movie that it appears in. But honestly, that isn't it at all. Because the name is really just a clever little nod to its two legendary parent strains. See, the white part comes directly from its mother, the super frosty White Widow, and the Russian part is a nod to its father, a strain called AK-47, which is of course also the name of a very famous Russian rifle. So the whole name is really all about its family tree. And honestly, its family is straight up cannabis royalty. White Russian is a direct cross of two of the single most celebrated and famous strains to ever come out of the entire 1990s Amsterdam scene. Its mother was the legendary White Widow, which was a strain so unbelievably frosty that it basically set the whole standard for resin production, and even won its own cannabis cup back in 1995. And its father was the equally famous AK-47, which was such a potent, hard-hitting powerhouse of a strain that it earned the nickname the One-Hit Wonder. In fact, it went on to become one of the single most awarded strains in all of cannabis history. But both of those legendary parent strains actually come with a little bit of their own mystery attached to them too. Because the real, true origin of White Widow is honestly still genuinely disputed, even to this very day. See, one very popular story out there credits a famous Australian breeder as the one who created it. But then a completely different story instead credits a Dutch grower, a guy who claims that he actually found the original seeds hidden away inside of a batch of imported hashish. And honestly, that whole argument has never really been fully settled by anyone. And its father, the famous AK-47, actually keeps its very own little secret too. It was originally created by the same breeder behind White Russian, all the way back in 1992, using a special mix of landrace strains gathered from all around the world. But that breeder has always very carefully kept the exact secret recipe completely locked away. In fact, he's famously compared keeping it a secret to the top secret formula for something like Coca-Cola. So both of White Russian's parents were legends, and both of them were shrouded in just a little bit of mystery. I actually have videos that go more in depth on both of those strains on my channel if you guys want to check them out. But back to White Russian's story. The man who brought those two legends together was the breeder behind Serious Seeds, a guy who simply goes by the name Simon. Now honestly, Simon's own personal story is a pretty unique one, because believe it or not, he was actually a former high school biology teacher. And for years and years, he didn't even smoke weed at all. It really wasn't until a life-changing trip through Africa, back in the 1980s, that his whole path completely changed. Because that's where he first tried pure cannabis and where he started collecting up seeds, which led him to eventually start his company, Serious Seeds, in 1995. Shortly after it was started, Serious Seeds quickly built up a reputation as being the opposite of a big hype machine. Because instead of just pumping out 100 different flashy new strains every single year, Simon always deliberately kept his catalog really small and tight. He would only ever release a brand new strain when he felt like it was truly worth it. And his entire focus was always on creating rock-solid, stable, and super reliable genetics. And that quiet, quality-first kind of approach is honestly a huge part of the reason why his strains went on to become such trusted, timeless classics. In fact, beyond just White Russian and AK-47, Simon is also the man behind several other legendary strains, like Chronic, Kali Mist, and Bubblegum. But the White Russian strain is the one that actually proved its incredible quality right out of the gate. Because in 1996, which was the very same year that it was first born, it went straight out and won the single biggest prize at the famous Cannabis Cup over in Amsterdam. It took home that coveted first-place win overall. And that massive, very early win instantly put the strain on the map for everyone. It completely cemented its legendary status pretty much overnight. And it didn't just stop there either, because it went on to pick up several more awards at various competitions over the following years. So this all brings us right back to that huge claim from the video's title. Was White Russian really and truly the single strongest strain in the entire world? And this is honestly where we have to be really, really honest with each other here. Because it's a case of a very real reputation, but with some genuinely thin proof to back it all up. See, the strain did earn itself a widespread reputation as being one of the very strongest options around at the time. But that specific strongest in the world title actually mostly traces right back to the company's very own marketing. Because Serious Seeds has long claimed that in some kind of independent comparison of 150 different strains, White Russian came out right on top, testing at around 22% THC. But honestly, nobody out there has ever really been able to verify that one specific test. Because there's no named lab anywhere, there's no clear date, and there's just no real, hard proof of it existing at all. And another really big point of confusion here is its famous Cannabis Cup win. Because that particular award was really just a judging and a tasting prize, one that was decided by a panel of people. It was honestly never some kind of official scientific measurement of it actually being the strongest. Now, to be totally and completely fair to it, that 22% number was genuinely incredible for its specific time. Because back in the 1990s, the average weed that you could get over in Amsterdam was really only testing at around 8% THC. So a strain that was actually hitting a full 22% back then was almost unheard of. It truly was a giant among all of the weed of its particular time. But that's also the exact reason why the whole strongest ever title just didn't end up lasting forever. See, these days, cannabis testing is way more accurate than it ever used to be. and modern strains have gotten just unbelievably strong. A whole lot of them now regularly test somewhere up in the high 20s, or honestly, even into the 30s. So while a strain hitting 22% was a genuine world beater back in the 90s, it's honestly just considered pretty good these days, but nothing all that crazy by today's standards. So, White Russian really and truly was one of the strongest strains in the entire world, but really only for one specific little moment in time. And there's honestly an interesting little twist to this whole potency story too. Because White Russian's very own father, the AK-47, actually has a much better documented claim to fame. Because it was once properly lab tested at a Cannabis Cup competition, where it officially came out as the single strongest entry there that entire year, testing at just over 21% THC. So funny enough, the kid ended up getting all of the strongest in the world fame over the years. But it was really the dad who actually had the hard scientific proof to back it all up. But documented or not, honestly, none of that really changes White Russian's true legacy one bit. Because it very much remains a beloved classic of that whole golden age of Amsterdam weed. It's a proud, true member of the legendary White family of strains, and for many years, it was famously sold to tourists in the Amsterdam coffee shops. And it's honestly still grown and loved by connoisseurs all over the entire world, even to this very day. In fact, it's even managed to make its way into plenty of legal, modern dispensaries. So at the end of the day, was White Russian actually the single strongest strain in the entire world? Well, for one brief, shining little moment back in the 1990s, it just very well might have been. And honestly, even if that famous title was always a little bit more about reputation than it was about hard, cold proof, it truly doesn't even matter one single bit. Because here is what really matters in the end. White Russian genuinely earned its place in weed history the honest way, as a truly potent, beautiful, and legendary strain that helped to define an entire era of cannabis. And honestly, that is a real legacy that no lab test could ever hope to measure. So what about you? Do you personally care all about chasing that highest possible THC number? Or do you think there's a whole lot more to great weed than that? Let me know down in the comments. And if you enjoyed this one, do me a favor and hit that like button. Subscribe for more deep dives like this one, and I'll catch y'all in the next one.